Commercial air travel is statistically the safest way to move around the planet, but buried in its history are a few disasters so unusual that they almost sound made up. A passenger jet that cruised on autopilot for hours, while nearly everyone on board was unconscious. A wide-body airliner that went down over Siberia because a teenager was sitting at the controls. And a plane that made a smooth, uneventful landing, taxied calmly off the runway, and still lost every single person on board. These are three aviation disasters that still feel almost impossible to explain. Late in the evening on August 13, 2005, a Boeing 737 belonging to the Cypriot airline Helios Airways was making its way from London to the island of Cyprus. During that flight, the cabin crew noticed a problem. The seal around a rear service door was making loud banging sounds, and there were signs of freezing around the door area. It was the kind of complaint that gets written up in the maintenance log and handed off to an engineer, and that's exactly what happened. The plane landed at Larnaca Airport at around 1:30 in the morning on August 14th. A British ground engineer named Alan Irwin was assigned to look into the door complaint, and as part of his inspection, he ran a pressurization leak check on the aircraft. To perform that test, the plane's pressurization system has to be switched from automatic to manual. Irwin found no leak, finished his work, and signed the aircraft off as ready to fly. The pressurization switch, however, was left in manual. It's worth noting that this particular aircraft had a troubled history with its pressurization. 8 months earlier, in December of 2004, the same aircraft had reportedly suffered a pressurization incident on a flight from Warsaw, and problems with that same rear door seal had been reported. The aircraft's own paperwork already showed that pressurization and door seal issues had not come out of nowhere. In the hours that followed, that one switch position would pass unnoticed through 3 separate opportunities to catch it. The pre-flight check, the after-start check, and the after-takeoff check all came and went without anyone on the flight deck registering that the system was set incorrectly. The crew taking the plane out that morning consisted of 2 pilots who had never flown together before. The captain was Hans-Jürgen Merten, a 58-year-old German contract pilot hired for the busy holiday season. He was hugely experienced, with roughly 17,000 hours in the air, across a career that stretched back decades. He was also known as a reserved man of few words, and his English was limited. The first officer was Pambos Charalambos, a 51-year-old Cypriot who had flown for Helios for about 5 years. Behind them, 115 passengers boarded the aircraft, including 22 children. Most were Cypriot families, and many of them were headed to Prague on holiday, with a stopover planned in Athens. Among the 6 crew members was a 25-year-old flight attendant named Andreas Prodromou. Andreas was working toward a career as a pilot and already held a commercial pilot's license, though he wasn't qualified on the 737. He had joined the flight at the last minute to work alongside his girlfriend, Haris Charalambous, a fellow flight attendant. The two were planning to marry. At 7 minutes past 9 in the morning, Helios Flight 522 lifted off from Larnaca and turned toward Athens. Because the pressurization system was in manual, the aircraft never sealed itself the way it was supposed to. As the jet climbed, the air inside the cabin thinned at almost the same rate as the air outside. Roughly 5 minutes after takeoff, as the plane passed through about 12,000 feet, a warning horn began to sound in the cockpit. That horn was telling the pilots the cabin altitude had exceeded 10,000 feet, meaning the air inside the plane was becoming dangerously thin. But there was a serious design problem hiding in that alarm. On the 737, the cabin altitude warning used the exact same sound as the takeoff configuration warning, an alarm that tells pilots the plane isn't set up correctly for takeoff. Boeing had reasoned that no one could confuse the two, because one could only sound on the ground and the other only in the air. Captain Merten confused them anyway. Believing he was dealing with a takeoff configuration problem while at altitude, something that made no sense, he radioed the Helios Operations Center for help. The man who answered his questions was Alan Irwin, the same engineer who had performed the leak check hours earlier. The conversation went in circles. Merten asked about cooling equipment lights. Irwin, trying to work the problem, asked him a question that in hindsight reads like a lifeline. Can you confirm that the pressurization panel is set to auto? By then, the thin air was already doing its work. Hypoxia, the medical term for oxygen starvation, is insidious, because the person experiencing it usually has no idea anything is wrong. Judgment fades first. Confusion sets in, sometimes accompanied by a strange sense of well-being, and then consciousness simply slips away. The pilot's oxygen masks in a 737 don't deploy automatically. They have to be put on, and neither pilot ever reached for one. The radio exchanges became fragmented and stopped making sense. Then they stopped altogether. In the cabin, the passenger oxygen masks dropped automatically as the plane climbed through roughly 18,000 feet. Those masks are designed for one purpose, which is to keep people conscious during the few minutes it takes a crew to dive the plane down to breathable air. They supply about 12 minutes of oxygen. On Flight 522, no dive ever came. The aircraft kept climbing on autopilot, exactly as it had been programmed, and leveled off at 34,000 feet. One by one, the 12 minutes ran out. The plane flew on. It crossed out of Cypriot airspace and into Greek airspace without a word. Athens air traffic control called the flight 19 times without an answer. And then the autopilot did something almost worse than failing. It kept working. It flew the programmed route to Athens, lined up with the arrival, and when no one was there to land it, flew the published missed approach and entered a holding pattern above the airport, circling at cruise altitude again and again. With hijacking fears running high in the years after September 11th, the Greek military scrambled 2 F-16 fighter jets to intercept. At 11:24 in the morning, the fighters pulled alongside the airliner, and when the fighter pilot looked through the cockpit windows, the scene was almost impossible to process. The first officer was slumped motionless over the controls. The captain's seat was empty. Through the cabin windows, the fighter pilot could see oxygen masks dangling from the ceiling, swaying gently, and passengers sitting motionless in their seats. At one point during the intercept, the fighter pilot reported seeing the first officer's body move, appearing to sit upright before slumping back over the controls, motionless again. He wasn't wearing an oxygen mask. The F-16s could do nothing but follow. For over an hour, one of the strangest scenes in modern aviation played out in the sky above Athens. A fully functional airliner, with 121 people aboard, flying perfect circles, escorted by fighter jets whose pilots could see everything and do absolutely nothing. Then, at around 11:49, nearly 3 hours after takeoff, the fighter pilot saw something that must have made his heart jump. A figure entered the cockpit and sat down in the captain's seat. It was Andreas Prodromo, the young flight attendant with the commercial pilot's license. He had somehow stayed conscious, most likely by moving between the cabin's portable oxygen bottles, which last far longer than the drop-down masks. He was also a trained scuba diver, and investigators believed his experience managing air supplies may have kept him alive. Andreas keyed the radio and called Mayday 5 times, but the aircraft's radio was still tuned to Larnaca, hundreds of miles behind them, so Athens controllers never received the calls. His transmissions were captured only by the cockpit voice recorder. He looked over at the F-16 flying off his wing and gave a brief wave. Moments later, the left engine flamed out. After more than 3 hours in the air, the fuel was gone. About 10 minutes after that, the right engine failed too, and the 737 began dropping toward the hills northwest of Athens. In the final moments, the aircraft's wings appeared to level, and the F-16 pilot came away believing Andreas was trying to soften the impact for the people behind him. At 4 minutes past noon, Flight 522 struck a hillside near the village of Grammatico. All 121 people on board were killed. The autopsies revealed a detail that made the tragedy even harder to absorb. The passengers were alive at impact, though investigators could not determine whether any of them were conscious. They had been carried in silence around the holding pattern while the world watched from below. In the days after the crash, a Greek man gave tearful interviews claiming his cousin on board had texted him from the doomed plane, writing that the pilot was dead and saying farewell. The story spread around the world. It was a complete fabrication. The man had no cousin on the flight, and he was convicted of spreading false information and given a suspended sentence. No such message ever existed. The official Greek investigation confirmed the chain of events, a pressurization switch left in manual, 3 missed chances to catch it, a warning horn the crew misread, and a slow, invisible slide into unconsciousness. Boeing was criticized for the ambiguous alarm, and the disaster led to safety changes meant to make pressurization warnings clearer, so crews would not have to interpret the same horn in two completely different emergencies. Criminal trials followed in both Cyprus and Greece, with executives acquitted in one country and convicted in the other. Helios Airways itself didn't survive the disaster. The airline rebranded, then collapsed entirely, and to this day, Flight 522 remains the deadliest aviation accident in Greek history. On the night of March 22, 1994, an Airbus A310 operated by Aeroflot pushed back from the gate in Moscow for a long overnight flight to Hong Kong. The aircraft was one of the crown jewels of the airline's fleet. After decades of flying Soviet-built planes, Aeroflot had recently acquired a handful of modern Western jets, and this A310 was barely more than a year old. On board were 63 passengers and 12 crew, 75 people in total. Many of the passengers were businessmen from Hong Kong and Taiwan, and around 30 of the Russians on board were airline employees and their family members, taking advantage of staff travel privileges. Because the flight to Hong Kong was so long, it carried an augmented flight crew of 3 pilots who would rotate through rest breaks. The captain for the first portion was Andrei Danilov, 40 years old and highly experienced. The first officer was 33-year-old Igor Piskaryov. And the relief captain, the man who would take command for the middle stretch of the night, was 39-year-old Yaroslav Kudrinsky, a veteran with nearly 9,000 hours in the air, though only about 900 of them were on the A310. Kudrinsky wasn't traveling alone. His 2 children were in the cabin, 13-year-old Yana and 15-year-old Eldar. It was their first international trip, and their father wanted to make it memorable. In the early hours of March 23rd, with the aircraft cruising at 33,000 feet over southern Siberia, Kudrinsky was in command with Piskaryov beside him. Captain Danilov was resting in the cabin. Most of the passengers were asleep, and at around 20 to 1 in the morning, Kudrinsky brought his children up front. In that era, cockpit visits during cruise were far more common than they are today. What happened next went well beyond a visit. Kudrinsky got out of the captain's seat and let his daughter sit in it. With the autopilot flying the plane, he turned the heading knob slightly, banking the jet gently left and right, and let Yana believe she was the one turning it. It was harmless in the way he intended it, a father's trick to give his daughter a story to tell. For a few moments, it was just a proud father showing his children a cockpit at 33,000 feet. Then Eldar took the seat, and the demonstration stopped being pretend. Unlike his younger sister, the 15-year-old didn't just rest his hands on the control column. He turned the control wheel and applied real force, roughly 8 to 10 kilograms. Then, as the autopilot tried to keep the aircraft on course, the system and the blocked control wheel began fighting each other. And that struggle triggered something in the A310's design that none of the 3 pilots in the cockpit fully understood. The autopilot on this aircraft was built to let a pilot physically override it on one axis without disconnecting entirely. When Eldar pushed against it long enough, the system quietly handed control of the ailerons, the surfaces that roll the plane, over to whoever was holding the wheel. The rest of the autopilot stayed engaged. There was no alarm and no warning sound. The only indication was a small silent light on the instrument panel. The 3 pilots had spent their careers on Soviet aircraft, where any change in the autopilot status was announced with a loud, audible warning. A silent light was outside their entire frame of experience, and nobody noticed it. So when Eldar's hands turned the wheel slightly to the right, the plane actually responded. The A310 began to bank, slowly at first, at about 2.5 degrees per second. According to translations of the cockpit voice recorder, Eldar was the first person to notice something was wrong. He asked why the plane was turning. 9 seconds doesn't sound like much, but in that time the bank steepened past 45 degrees, far beyond anything a passenger jet does in normal service. The autopilot, still controlling the pitch and thrust, tried to compensate for the steepening turn by pulling the nose up and adding power. The bank kept rolling toward 90 degrees. The G-forces in the cockpit climbed until the adults were being pressed into their seats, struggling to move, while a 15-year-old sat pinned at the controls of a wide-body jet. The aircraft stalled, the autopilot gave up and disconnected completely, and the A310 dropped into a dive over the Siberian mountains. Piskaryov, whose seat was slid all the way back, fought his way forward to the controls and managed to pull the plane out of the dive. The recovery was too aggressive, and the jet pitched into a near vertical climb, stalled a second time, and fell into a spin. Kudrinsky, back at the controls with his son finally out of the seat, wrestled with the aircraft as it plunged. Twice, the pilots came agonizingly close to regaining control. On the final attempt, they actually managed to level the wings. There was no altitude left. At roughly 2 minutes to 1 in the morning, the aircraft struck a remote hillside in the Kuznets-Galatau Mountains, coming down flat, landing gear up, at a descent rate later estimated at around 70 meters per second. All 75 people on board were killed. From the moment Kudrinsky's children first sat down in his seat to the moment of impact, only about 16 minutes had passed. No distress call was ever made. Searchers found many of the passengers still strapped into their seats, a detail that made the silence of those final minutes even harder to imagine. The crash site sat on a wooded hillside about 20 kilometers from the mining town of Mezdurichensk, far from any road. It took searchers until the second day to locate the flight recorders in the scattered wreckage. When family members were eventually able to visit the site, Russian relatives laid flowers among the trees, while families from Hong Kong and Taiwan scattered paper messages across the hillside according to their own traditions. In the aftermath, Aeroflot flatly denied that children had been anywhere near the cockpit. That denial held until a Moscow magazine obtained and published the cockpit voice recorder transcript about 6 months later, and the airline was forced to admit what had happened. The investigation found nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft. Every system was functioning exactly as designed. In the years that followed, cockpit access became harder to justify, and after later security changes across the industry, the casual era of flight deck visits effectively disappeared. And then there was the finding that has haunted pilots ever since. Investigators concluded that if the crew had simply let go of the controls, the A310 may very well have recovered itself. Of the 3 stories in this video, the last one stands apart, because the aircraft involved didn't crash at all. On the evening of August 19, 1980, Saudia Flight 163 was making its way from Karachi, Pakistan to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, with a stopover in the Saudi capital of Riyadh. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, a huge 3-engine wide body that was barely a year old. After the stop in Riyadh, 301 people were on board, 287 passengers and 14 crew. Many of the passengers were Pakistani and Iranian pilgrims traveling toward Mecca, and the cabin was full of families. The flight deck crew consisted of 3 men, and the official accident report would later document serious concerns about all of them. The captain was 38-year-old Muhammad Ali Kawaiter, whose training file described him as slow to learn, needing more training than normally required, and having difficulty whenever he was asked to deviate from a set routine. The first officer was 26-year-old Sami Hassanain, who had once been dropped from the airline's pilot training program for poor progress before being reinstated, and who had earned his qualification on the TriStar just 11 days before the flight. The flight engineer was 42-year-old Bradley Curtis, an American who had failed pilot training at the airline and moved to the engineer's seat instead. The accident report noted that he may have been dyslexic, and that this may have affected his ability to work through emergency checklists under pressure. At 8 minutes past 9 in the evening, Flight 163 lifted off from Riyadh for what should have been a routine hop to Jeddah. Just under 7 minutes later, a warning lit up at the flight engineer's station. Smoke in the aft cargo compartment, a space known as C3, buried beneath the passenger cabin floor. Less than a minute later, a second smoke warning followed. What the crew did next set the tone for everything that followed. Instead of treating the warnings as an emergency, they began discussing whether the alarms were real. For more than 5 minutes, the crew worked through manuals and discussed what the warnings meant, and Curtis eventually left the cockpit to check the cabin himself. When he came back, the discussion was no longer theoretical. There was smoke in the rear of the cabin. The cargo hold where the fire started was certified under a standard known as Class D. The idea behind that certification was that a sealed compartment with no airflow would starve any fire of oxygen until it smothered itself, and because of that assumption, the compartment had no fire extinguishing system built in, and no way for the crew to access it in flight. The fire in C3 did not smother itself. It burned through the compartment's lining, and then it began burning up through the floor of the passenger cabin. Around this time, the captain finally turned the aircraft back toward Riyadh. In the cabin behind him, a nightmare was unfolding. Smoke was thickening in the rear of the plane, flames were coming up through the floor, and the flight attendants were fighting the fire with handheld extinguishers, while hundreds of frightened passengers pushed forward, away from the smoke, crowding into the front half of the aircraft. In the middle of the emergency, the fire burned through the control cables for the center engine, and its thrust lever jammed in place. The crew shut that engine down on approach. The cockpit voice recorder from those minutes captured behavior that investigators struggled to explain. As the emergency deepened, Captain Kiter could be heard whistling and singing to himself, and working through checklist items that had nothing to do with the situation. Flight engineer Curtis repeatedly told the pilots there was no problem. Investigators would later suggest the crew never truly grasped how much danger they were in. Meanwhile, flight attendants were coming forward begging for instructions, and the captain's response was captured on the recorder. He told them, "Tell them not to evacuate." At 25 minutes to 10, Flight 163 touched down at Riyadh. The landing was smooth. The aircraft was on the ground, intact, with fire trucks standing by and a 4-kilometer runway stretching out ahead of it. At that moment, many lives may still have been savable. Then, instead of standing on the brakes and stopping on the runway, the captain let the aircraft roll. The TriStar continued down the entire length of the runway at taxi speed, turned off onto a taxiway, and came to a stop facing back the way it had come. 2 minutes and 40 seconds had passed since touchdown. Fire vehicles chased the plane the whole way. The crew radioed the tower that they were shutting down the engines and evacuating. But the engines kept running. For another 3 minutes and 15 seconds after the aircraft stopped, all of the TriStar's remaining engines continued to turn, and rescue crews could not safely approach the aircraft while its engines were still running. Firefighters could only stand back and watch the glow spreading through the cabin windows. The crew's final transmission was a response to a warning about fire at the tail. "Affirmative, we are trying to evacuate now." Then the engines finally spooled down, and the radio went silent. No doors opened. No slides deployed. Nothing moved. What followed was a rescue effort that the official report would condemn as unequipped and untrained for what it faced. The response teams struggled to reach the aircraft and get a door open. By the time the first door was finally opened, more than 20 minutes had passed since the engines stopped. Roughly 3 minutes after that door opened, the oxygen rushing into the superheated interior triggered a flash fire that consumed the cabin from front to back. One later account from the rescue effort described the heat at the door as so intense that even gloved hands could barely stay against it. Every single one of the 301 people on board was dead. The autopsies told investigators when and how. The victims had died of smoke inhalation, poisoned by carbon monoxide and other toxic fumes, and they had died before that first door was ever opened. Their bodies were found concentrated in the forward half of the aircraft, many of them bunched around the exits, pressed together at doors that never opened. Some of them were untouched by the flames. The Saudi investigation, conducted with assistance from Lockheed and American investigators, was never able to determine what started the fire. A persistent story claims a passenger's butane stove ignited the blaze, and while camping stoves were found in the wreckage, the report explicitly found the fire did not start in the cabin, and no ignition source was ever proven. What the report did conclude was damning enough. The fire began in the C3 cargo compartment for reasons that were never determined, then spread after the compartment's liner failed to contain it. The contributing factors were the captain's failure to prepare the cabin for evacuation, his failure to stop the aircraft and evacuate immediately after landing, his failure to make use of his crew, and a rescue operation that wasn't ready for the disaster in front of it. The report also found that the doors were physically capable of being opened, and that there was no evidence anyone inside ever attempted the emergency opening procedure. 301 people remained inside an aircraft whose doors were still operable, while the order and conditions needed for evacuation never came together. For weeks afterward, the burned-out hulk of the TriStar sat on the tarmac at Riyadh, a blackened monument visible to every flight coming and going from the airport. In the wake of the disaster, Saudia overhauled its training programs, put new emphasis on teaching junior crew members to speak up and challenge their captains, and ended the practice of rehiring pilots who had previously failed training. Flight 163 also forced regulators to confront the false promise of the sealed cargo compartment. After another fatal cargo compartment fire brought down ValueJet Flight 592 in 1996, regulators finally moved to eliminate Class D cargo compartments on transport aircraft. At the time it happened, this was the second deadliest accident ever involving a single aircraft. More than 4 decades later, it remains the deadliest aviation disaster in which the plane never crashed. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to leave it in the comments below. I will see you in the next one.